The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something else that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone fixed me on it. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello, I'm here with a friend of the show by proxy, Kristina from Kristina on Twitch, and Movie Night Extravaganza, which is where we overlap. You are a co-host now?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Like I'm working on figuring out how to do Conan's letterbox whenever he's not available, but I guess when Andy's not available, I do the plugs too, and they joke that I did a better job than him, and I'm like, oh hush guys. I'm more of a talkative person.
Well, yeah. Andy and his obsession with Stargate aside. Andy and I are almost the same age. We just don't look like we're the same age. So it's a kind of fun. Yeah, it's a kind of fun. Apparently, I don't age.
Good.
It's a useful habit. I'm 42. So yeah, I know. Wow.
Nice.
It's all that baby's blood. No, I'm kidding. So, I discovered that you literally live across the river from where I was born. I was born in Augusta, Georgia, and you live in Aiken?
Yep.
Not to dox you, but around Aiken.
I talked about where I was born in Freehold, New Jersey, which is the home of Bruce Springsteen. And then we decided to move down south because my mom was always close with my grandparents, her parents, so she moved down here for them. And I've been here since I was like 5 years old. And the funny thing about it is people are like, you've been down here your whole life. Where's your Southern accent? Because the way you pronounce certain words does not sound completely Southern. You have a bit of a Northern likeness to your voice. And I'm like, it's because I worked so hard to not sound like this, growing up, being around a lot of people with Southern accents. I tried so hard to not sound like this.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I get that too, actually, that, I've been gone for 13 years, but my Southern accent was obliterated before I even left the South.
Yeah.
And that was partly for reasons that I'm not proud of. It was class educational pressure that I don't think is fair, but then there's also like a cultural identification that I really didn't want to have either.
Yeah.
Although every now and then I want to sound y'all-ish again, but
yeah. Also too, where I live, all the Yankees and New Englanders moved down here to retire and buy land and buy horses. So you're surrounded by a lot of people who have like the New England accents, the New York accents, those accents. So because I think Aiken's like the third top place to retire in the whole country, I believe. Yeah. So that's also has something to do with it. So a lot of the people that I grew up around did not have like strong accents. So that kind of, and plus I watched a lot of old Hollywood films. So I was like, I need to sound like Grace Kelly, but I failed.
Well, the transatlantic accent's hard to mimic these days. But,
yeah.
Since it was never spoken anywhere in the first place. But
yep.
I remember as a kid when I watched old movies that would come on Turner Classics, or actually at that time just Turner Broadcasting, and wondering why everybody sounded vaguely British.
Yeah.
For no apparent reason.
It's because the silent film era ended, and when they heard some people talk, they were like, "Oh, your class is showing."
Yep. So we're going to invent an accent that sounds posh, but and can be identifiable as either British or American because we want both markets, but is natural to nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty interesting. It's actually, I want to study more about why it faded out.
Yeah. Because, like, I watched the one Gothic soap opera, Dark Shadows, from, like, the 1960s, and they had those accents as well, because a lot of those actors come from that era of Hollywood. So I'm thinking that a lot of the actors that were born post, like, 1940s, like, after the 1930s, they probably stopped giving, like, those types of, like, dialect, like, training, perhaps?
Yeah, you still see it though pretty late. Like, Song of the South, in addition to being racist, only bad characters have a Southern accent. All the good, upstanding characters have this weird hybrid transatlantic accent, and I think that's in the 60s. So
Yeah.
Disney held on to it for a while, but in general, I think you're probably right, because you start seeing naturalistic acting and like non-kids movies probably in the early 60s.
And more nitty-gritty films post, like, the sexual revolution.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and the abolishment of the Hays Code being the other major thing. Because although I find that a lot of people outside of the United States think that the Hays Code was imposed by the government, and they don't realize it was imposed by the movie industry itself to avoid government regulation.
Yeah.
Kind of proto-neoliberalism there. But
Mm-hmm.
self-regulation and all that rot.
Yeah.
So, Aiken is an interesting place, though, because it's both wealthy and poor simultaneously, as all of that North Georgia, Southern South Carolina, along Savannah River is.
Mm-hmm.
You go to like Augusta, half of the town is uber rich retirees, and the other half of the town is like one of the most ghetto places you'll see anywhere in the South.
They call it Disgusta for a reason.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Which is sad. I mean, like, going on, like, the Riverwalk. I remember when Bernie hosted a rally, and there was, like, a dude in his boat with, like, Bernie 2020. I'm like, that dude lives right on the river, and he's got a Bernie 2020, like, going in the background on his boat, making sure he can be seen at the rally. I'm like, I didn't expect that, but okay.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Augusta's politics are interesting because it's
lots of corruption.
It's a very corrupt city, but it's also a very black city. And you go across the river into South Carolina, and it's a bunch of white retirees, and that's also true around the larger Norfolk Augusta area. And so it's it's this instinct I have where I like distrust Alabamians because of Southern classism, because Georgians see themselves as slightly higher class than Alabamians.
Yeah.
But then we also distrust Charlestonites and South Carolina and Columbians because they're planter class, and you can't are Yankees, and you can't trust them either.
Yeah. Because those are like the bluer areas, which is weird because I found out there are more Democratic voters in the district than like Republican voters in my district. But because of gerrymandering, Joe Wilson and Lindsey Graham will forever be the congressman and the senator in the district. Which is really, really depressing.
Yeah, well, any southern city is probably going to be a lot more Democrat and demographics than people realize. Yeah, for complicated reasons. I mean, the Dixiecrat infrastructure got partly handed over to the Black Congressional Caucus, but it also didn't entirely go away in the cities. So you still have this weird mixture of progressive and hyper-conservative Democrats in these cities that kind of factions in themselves. But also, Southern politics is extremely corrupt. And so...
I mean, South Carolina was blue, but the problem was the Democrats were corrupt. And I think it's funny because when we moved down here in 99, that's when things started to change for South Carolina. That's when it like went red. And I'm over here like, did we, by moving down here, turn South Carolina red?
Wow. Yeah, we talking about my age. I was 19 and 20 when that shift happened in South Carolina and Georgia simultaneously. Both went from blue to deep bright red
Yeah.
almost overnight. And what I told people is, in both states, actually, a lot of the same congressional reptiles were Democrats, and they literally just switched their party affiliation the moment that there was a Republican governor.
Yeah.
But they still controlled the city electoral basis, and so it's very strange to try to explain that to outsiders.
Yeah.
There's also a tendency, and you may or may not agree with this, but in purplish states, Republicans actually tend to be more aggressive and more batshit than they do in solid red states. And I say that because I live in Utah, in the Mountain West, except for Colorado and Nevada, are bright red, deep Republican, but our Republicans are not Southern Republicans. They don't pull the same stunts. They're not interested in the. We do have those people in our legislatures and whatnot, but they don't tend to win the governorship or actually control everything the way they do in the South.
Yeah, like the governor of Utah actually was like, I'm not signing this anti-trans legislation.
Yeah, exactly. He didn't want a lawsuit. He also didn't think it was moral. They overrid it because of local legislatures' national concerns. But the anti-trans issues here have not been at the same fever pitch that they have been in, say, Georgia and
or even
Florida, South Carolina. Yeah,
like McMaster, he signed an anti-trans youth athlete bill, and I literally sent him. I was like, dude, name one trans youth athlete in the state of South Carolina. Name one.
Yeah, we have one, and this bill and its response is a response to one athlete.
It's always one, or even none.
My other favorite thing is a number of people from Davis County, which in Utah politics is next. Oh, not Davis County. I forgot the county, but Davis School District, which is outside of SLC pretty significantly. But if you know anything about our politics in Utah, it's like Atlanta, actually. The city, Salt Lake, is, Gomorrah as far as the Mormons are concerned. But the surrounding area is actually more conservative than even the lot of the rural areas in the state. And Davis is constantly getting in trouble for all kinds of discrimination issues, but yet somehow they're always making on the libs of TikTok. So it's like, yeah. So they're finding the one or two teachers and then pretending that this is systemic. And I suspect editing the videos highly so you don't know the context when you watch them. Most of these teachers have quit before I've been able to talk to them. So
yeah, the libs of TikTok is like a new version of like all those like women from like the 70s who were like trying to save the children and whatnot. And it's just like the fact that Twitter still allows that account to even exist is baffling. I mean, there is a chuds of TikTok which wants to try to combat the libs of TikTok, and I'm like, I'm all for it. I'm all for it because you see more conservatives actually doing stuff in context that is horrific. Share it.
We by far we have a political neutrality law in Utah as far as like what you're allowed to teach in the classroom, and in practice it's been violated more by, say, conservative usually substitute teachers, honestly, than it has been liberals. Yeah. But nonetheless, it's that said, I have had to coach a lot of young teachers in how to not speak social justice language because now it's all flagged and it'll get people, in your classroom and recording you very quickly.
You can't say a cab. You just can't.
Yeah, it's just like, you're going to need to you're going to need to speak in a very particular way. Like one of the things I get really tired of these debates around stuff like birth givers versus women versus whatever.
Yeah.
I think the Pascal Robert was on Brianna Joy Gray's show, and Brianna Gray was going back and forth about, whether we should use people who menstruate versus, and I was just like, you can just say people. Like, you don't have to by saying that, you don't have to shove anyone under the bus.
Yeah.
But it's not gonna set off this culture war issue either.
Yeah. Because did you see the Josh Hawley thing?
Oh my God, yeah.
I was like, trans men can menstruate. I don't know if you know this, but also too, like, these people define women as women, people like those who can't give birth. I'm like, okay, then what about cisgender women who are incapable of getting pregnant? What are they then?
Yeah, it was actually interesting. I'm writing a book on Christopher Lasch, and this is an issue that comes up with him on families in the 80s, and it's something that I will admit as we talked about my age, actually important stuff like this, and I was also gone during most of the aught teens. I was not in the country. And the cultural shift in about 10 years, I do think has been hyper accelerated from gay marriage being illegal when I left, insert in like 30 states, to trans acceptance being a mainstream issue. But I do think we have to figure out ways for people to show solidarity without tripping cultural war attacks, because one of the things I thought that Josh Hawley thing did is just totally derailed actual talk of Roe v. Wade, completely. And so I'm always thinking about, well, how do we phrase this where we don't throw anyone under the bus when we're talking to the general public, but also, and we can introduce like birth giver is kind of a weird neologism, but it's grammatically fine and it's like perfectly accurate. But it's, the whole thing is maddening how the right has been able to seize on these issues.
And when Democrats are like, we just ignore when the Republicans try to do this culture war stuff. I'm like, yeah, but here's the problem. They're doing this for the midterms. The damage is already going to be done. Whether or not they lose or win, you guys are not tackling these things.
No. I mean, if they tackle it at all, it seems to be only on the level of actually only on the level of like pushing a culture war and then retracting and complaining that it exists. Like, they're not doing anything legislatively about any of it.
Yeah. They're literally like, the trans community needs to be more discreet and blah 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 blah. And I'm over here like, what are you saying, that they should just like be in the closet? Like, what does that even mean?
It reminds me of something out of a labor sympathetic paper called The New Statesman in the UK that was talking about, well, maybe, what did it say? And this is I think the culture issue is actually worse in the UK right now on this issue. But it was saying labor or something has to address the conservatives' legitimate complaints about the trans question, which the trans question trips off so many alarm bells in me, because I'm like, okay, where have I heard X identity question before? Like,
it's been used for different, demographics of people throughout history.
Right. And it's almost always usually to get rid of them.
Yep.
The Roma question, the Jewish question, the Black question, etc. Mm-hmm. So it's hard right now, though, because it does seem like women's issues are particularly under attack.
Yeah.
and in ways that I didn't foresee 10 years ago. So
the moon fell into Lake Michigan.
yeah.
Some jag-all comedian said that would never happen. No. Oh, really?
Yeah, it's been about 5 years ago I started thinking that, and this is a kind of ironic way of thinking, but like since the evangelical community was actually shrinking, but it and the conservatives that we deal with are actually more secular, that to maintain the allegiance of that small but highly devoted demographic, instead of dangling the culture war bait like they had since the 70s, they might actually start delivering it to them.
Yeah.
And now I don't know that anyone on the Supreme Court planned this, but that seems to be where we're at. And even more worrying. Now, I'm going to say this with the caveat that I have thought that Roe v. Wade's legal jurisprudence was always a problem because the right to autonomy based off an implied right to the right to bodily autonomy was never established. Instead, you had the establishment of an implied right to privacy that was based off of an expansion of the Due Process Clause and a reading of the 14th Amendment. And even Ruth Bader Ginsburg had thought that that was like particularly shaky, but if you removed it, pretty much all the civil rights legislation, including things like Loving versus Virginia, frankly.
Yeah, Clarence Thomas forgot to mention that one in his little note.
Yeah.
I wonder why.
Fall apart. It's pretty clear. I mean, Thomas made it explicit, but even when you look at Alito's ruling and go through it and see stuff, you will notice that like he doesn't. He, for example, does not mention Obergefell as one of the things that could not be undone or shouldn't be undone by this ruling. And Thomas clearly wants to go back to Texas versus Lawrence. The
Policing
ruling
of sex in your own home, essentially.
Well, what's interesting is it would actually be worse than when it was actually the law, because in the 80s and 90s they did not generally charge people with sodomy unless it was in conjunction with another crime, which is still shitty. But now, if they were to reverse it, you also have rolls and rolls of people who are married who have now admitted to committing a crime that even though they should be protected by normal rights, that you can't go back and punish something that was legal when you did it and is illegal now, they would still be actively breaking the law, and you have a list of where they are.
Yeah, and you think of also people who work in like the adult film industry as well. I'm like, they're committing crimes left and right then.
Oh yeah. I mean, and what makes it interesting, if you look at these bills coming out of these evangelical and Catholic think tanks that are giving this to state legislatures, they're actually trying to reach into the laws of other states, which does set up kind of a time bomb as far as like the legal rulings that could happen. And it's to me, I have not been scared of civil war talk. I mean, it's been rampant for the last 3 years, but I've always thought it was kind of ridiculous. There's no material base for the polarization. But when you start putting different states at odds with each other legally, and you weaken the 14th Amendment and the Supremacy Clause of the Supreme Court, you are setting up something for actual conflict between states.
Especially when people have to go travel God knows how many miles to get an abortion.
Unfortunately, that's also been true this entire time, which is why Obama's failure to codify abortion rights has been such a frustrating thing. I mean,
it's interesting how no blame is on the Democrats. People are like, well, they make excuses. I'm like, no, Obama said he was going to do it.
Yep. It was
He
one of the
should have
many
gotten
things
Ruth
he
Bader
said he was
Ginsburg
going
to
to do.
retire. She was going to die. We knew that she was probably going to die when Trump was in office.
I think they just were arrogant and didn't think Trump would ever be in office. Which is,
Pied Piper strategy, am I right?
Yeah.
They're doing that for a lot of candidates too now. They're popping up the MAGA candidates. I
am now really worried about the Democrats because there's almost no way they keep the House in November. There's very little chance they're going to keep the Senate. They might because of the Supreme Court, but it's still pretty iffy. Yeah. They have lost state elections in strategically bad years to lose them. Yeah. Now in 2 cycles, which has exacerbated gerrymandering concerns. And we know that even in the best of times, the Supreme Court has been pretty okay with just allowing gerrymandering to be rampant. Here in Salt Lake, for example, I'm in a district that extends to St. George, which, if you don't know what that means, but that's on the border of Nevada. Oh. So it's way far away from where I live, and the district's just like drawn in this strange way that like cuts across a rural strip of state, dips into Salt Lake, which is clearly a blue city, and then cuts it back and weakens it out.
They draw them out. I mean, it should be just regular looking shapes, but no, they make them look like all squiggly and like it's just, and then like something's like backwards, and it just looks so weird. I'm like, this is what you came up with?
Yeah, it's frustrating.
But I'm worried because my mom did not know this about birth control being a thing that the Supreme Court had to decide on. I'm like, oh yeah, Mom, birth control is probably going to be on the chopping block too. She's like, no. I'm like, yes, the Supreme Court intends on getting rid of birth control. Okay, now people who need birth control are probably not going to be able to get it.
I mean, we've already seen these knock-on effects from even stuff that has nothing to do with birth control, like the number of people who are on rheumatoid arthritis medication who now can't get it because the rheumatoid arthritis medication can induce a miscarriage. So it's now you have to call and prove in some states that it's not being prescribed for an abortion. Yeah. And I think we're going to see that increase, despite the fact that I think Joe Biden has said he's passed some kind of executive order to make that to safeguard that. But I'm like, your executive order does jack and shit if you can't
make it like the law of the land, regardless of what the Supreme Court says.
Right, because executive orders are extremely weak as far as dealing with conservative jurisprudence. And again, that seems to be where we are now. So I'm assuming that your state has a trigger law that just got tripped.
6 weeks, I think.
What's the exact wording? Ours is we have one too, but
it's all at the heart. If there's a heartbeat, if there's a heartbeat, you can't get an abortion
for any reason.
I think there's probably exceptions for rape or incest, but even then, a lot of people still don't even believe when there's cases of rape and incest.
Right. We have issues in Utah because they do have rape, incest, and life of the mother protections, but the legal wording is actually vague, and even conservative lawyers don't know what the line is or how it's drawn. It appears that the law was written to not ever actually be in place. It was one of those things that was passed. It was a symbolic gesture. Yes, a lot of people passed it, meant it, but the people who wrote it didn't write it in a clear enough legal way because they probably didn't really think it would ever come up. So we expect a lot of lawsuits to emerge out of case law because no one can figure out what is and is not legal under the exceptions clause in our state.
Yeah.
And so, again, here we go. Although it seems like, in general, if I was going to say anything, the American legal system's kind of falling to pieces.
Yeah.
So it's.
I mean, my town has a crisis pregnancy center.
Mhm.
Which a lot of people are like, what are those? I'm like, those places that are like right next to a Planned Parenthood clinic, and they try to talk you out of getting an abortion and fearmonger that abortion causes breast cancer, and Plan B is actually an abortion pill, even though they specifically say you take it only like 48 to 72 hours after intercourse. Like, yeah, those people.
Yeah. Funny story. In my first marriage, we had a pregnancy scare, in quotation marks. Actually, we wanted it. But we went to one of those centers thinking it was just a place to get testing and like more reliable pregnancy testing and some prenatal care.
Yeah.
And it was all Jesus all the time. And we were very pissed off. It wasn't like we neither me or my partner at the time were actually even trying to pursue an abortion. It was just, there was no other clear thing to go to.
And their advice, literally because they have their own websites, like, move if you're financially struggling, move in with the father of the baby and his parents. And I'm like, that's not really like. And also too, they're like, abortion clinics are so small and crowded and dirty and filthy and just unkept. And I'm like, it's like that one scene in Juno, which I love the movie, but that one scene about the abortion clinic really pissed me off.
Yeah, Juno is an interesting film. I don't know that it's aged super well, but many things don't. So here we are. And I think one of the things for the Democrats on this is that they clearly seem to think, and I know that, I mean, I feel like this is absolutely clear because Joe Biden was still set to appoint an anti-choice judge to a southern district as a favor than Mitch McConnell. Apparently, that Mitch McConnell didn't even totally ask for or make a trade with him for.
Yeah, he's like, I'm just giving this to you because we're friends.
It's worrying because it indicates that they do not understand the game that was played with the courts, or if they do understand it, they don't give a shit. No. And that this was seen for them as a way to fundraise, sadly. Like, it does seem like that's mostly what they've done with it. And yet, as a calculus, it seems to me to have backfired because it makes them look utterly weak. This happened under their watch.
Yeah. The House, the Senate, the presidency, and it's funny because Sean Hannity said abortion would never become illegal. I'm like, if you live in a conservative, and the thing is, the right thinks that the left controls everything. I'm like, you guys have the school boards, local, like, state legislators, city council, like, you guys control most of the country, believe it or not. You guys have the hold.
One of the things that I think people need to. I was arguing with another Marxist from Platypus about this once, actually, because he was asserting that the Democrats are the dominant party, and I'm like, not if you look at state to state, they're not.
No.
They do oversee some of the biggest metropolitan areas, but even if you just go on raw numbers, more people live in conservative states, and it's wild to me that this is what it's coming down to, and yet I'm looking at the backbench for the Democrats, and there's nobody except for Newsom, who I think a lot of blue state liberals overstate the appeal of, because as I've pointed out, it took Trump for there to be a New York City mayor. President's mayor, because so many New York mayors had tried and they don't do well in the rest of the country. Yeah. Similarly, Reagan, I think, is the last California president we had. I don't see Newsom carrying most of the country. I may be wrong about that. Maybe things have changed, but I doubt it. And
I'm like, screw it. Bernie 2024, third time's the charm is what the little tagline of the his campaign's gonna be. Because the progressive left doesn't have someone to be given, no one's passed the torch. And even AOC is like, the Pelosi's and Schumer's aren't training us aren't grooming us to be future leaders of the party. They're not doing anything about that. And I'm like, well, fuck, that ain't good to know.
Particularly when I have my critiques of both Bernie and AOC, but one of the things that I have been noting is the Democrats, even more than the Republicans, are a gerontocracy. It occurred to me, actually, weirdly, I was watching the Trump, I think the first Trump impeachment, and I had always been like, how is Ted Cruz dancing circles around these people? And then I watched all these ancient Democrats from New York and California speak, and they were all in their 70s and 80s, and I'm just like, oh shit. You guys have been in safe districts for so long, you have no idea what competition even looks like or how to speak to people anymore.
Dianne Feinstein is running again. Chuck Grassley's running it. Even though he's a Republican, they love him. But my heart sank when I read that article about the doctor who's in charge of giving all of Congress and the Senate their like Alzheimer's and dementia medications. I'm like, my heart sank. I was like, these people are in charge of our lives?
Yeah, it's been funny because I've been listening to baby boomer political strategists beg for these baby boomer and lost generation Congress people to step down. I mean, it's actually kind of amazing that during the Obama administration, we finally had Gen X presidents and politics was going to be younger again. Obama, partly for reasons that are understandable but ultimately damning, did not bring many people up with him. No. And because of that, we ended up with the same power people that you saw in the early 90s come back in force. And it looks like we're going to be choosing between octogenarians for the next couple of election cycles until some probably young reactionary unseats them. And then what are we going to see the Dems do? And the only thing I can figure is they're going to be a toothless opposition like they were for Trump and Bush.
Yeah.
So
they just don't fight.
No, I mean, and they only became ascendant because of how bad Trump, honestly, both Trump and Bush screwed up. But you can't rely on that forever.
Yeah, you can't rely on, look at all the bad stuff Trump did. Like, okay, he's no longer in office. It's your job to fix it.
It's interesting because Biden right now in most straw polls loses to either Trump or DeSantis, but he loses far worse to DeSantis. It's close with Trump.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
DeSantis is going to be president in a couple of years, and I'm not ready for that. Florida's just a test run.
Yep. So, what is it like being a young social democrat? I ask because I came of age when socialists were, except for some weird ancient trots and some people you met in college who no one took seriously, a hyper marginal group of people. And until 2014, we always felt like a hyper marginal group of people.
Yeah.
Occupy happened. We became part of first an alt media narrative, and then increasingly more and more into slightly closer to the mainstream. But I have kind of felt like, unfortunately, what has not happened is for socialists to feel like they have fully distinguished themselves from just general progressive Democrats. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I know people from like every little like faction of the left. Like there are people who label themselves as postmodern, neo-Marxist, pre-Bolshevik era libertarian socialists. Like people like to lay on the labels a little too thick, and I'm like, that turns the average voter off. Don't do that. Just say you're a leftist, and that's what I do. I just say I'm a leftist. Like I'm not one who digs into theory because I know theory can bore like the average person who's not a political person. I've noticed that issues and policies what drives people to be more interested in like leftist politics. Like that's how you sway people. And when you tell them if you beat them to death with like the Communist Manifesto, they're not going to be interested. They're not. Because most of these voters are working class people. And as someone who's volunteered for Bernie's campaign twice, I've kind of evolved from being your standard like liberal Democrat to like a leftist. And it's harder when you're in a red state like South Carolina, when you already have a Democratic Party that doesn't do anything. The only time they're ever awake is when there's election cycle. We always have carpetbaggers coming into the districts to run against, Joe Wilson. They were born in South Carolina. They leave South Carolina. They come down here just to run for Congress or a Senate, and I'm like, you're gonna lose because of gerrymandering, and you don't even know the district. Like things have changed since you've left. So it's just disappointing to be a leftist in a red state because there's really nowhere to go besides going to like the CSRA chapter of DSA in Augusta.
Well, actually, interestingly, as a dyed-in-the-wool ideologue, which I am, I also have found that the labels aren't particularly useful. My reason for it, there's two reasons. One is they're not predictive of someone's actual politics, actually. Like if I asked the average Marxist-Leninist any question on any number of issues, I'm going to get 50 different answers, even on like basic things, except for like Stalin being great. But why Stalin is great, you can get 50 different answers. You can get a whole lot of different reasons, and that's fine, I guess. But it means it's non-predictive to me. It doesn't give me much information, and it alienates people who are not the same ideology as you, which in the case of most forms of Marxism is still most people. I mean, even though socialism is no longer the scary word that was 20 years ago, despite Republicans trying to gin up the fear again.
Yeah.
They don't seem to be able to carry their Cold War down past maybe Gen Xers.
Yeah. And there's even like newer labels like patriotic socialist. And a lot of people are like, what are those? I'm like, it's just the LaRouche movement. Like, it's just another term for like LaRouche followers at this point. Just trying to bring communists and socialists over to the right.
Yeah, that's a fun one. That happens. What's interesting is a lot of people that, even some of the same people actually, that drove this now tried to do it during the end of Occupy during the Obama administration.
Yeah.
With the same theorists, like they were back when Alexander Dugin was first translated into English, they were trying to push that stuff, and they failed. And they're more successful now, I think, because of the disappointment of the Bernie campaign in 2019.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is it very much reminds me of the growth of LaRoucheism after Carter, which, of course, even I'm not old enough to remember, but I have studied. And and you see that again. I think that's going to be an interesting and difficult development to deal with, actually, because
especially since a lot of people like to label them like to LARP as communists and socialists just for like, the aesthetic. Those people who don't really know what communism and socialism are, who they think it's cool and edgy, are more likely to fall down the patriotic socialist type of like pipeline. And also too, clearly some people, I'm not going to name names, are getting paid to be this way. Clearly, like they know the audience capture is with the right. So the Jimmy Dores and the Jackson Hinkles, like those types clearly are following the money and know where the audience is. And there's no money to be made on the left.
That's interesting to me, though. I actually have thought about that a lot. I don't disagree with you, but part of that is our weird relationship to establishment liberalism. My example of that is like, look, Bhaskar Sankara is now the president of the Nation Foundation. That means that as far as democratic socialists go, we've been accepted as legitimate by the progressive left. But that also means that the institutional money and power that you would expected to have come with that has not trickled down to anybody. I don't even think it's trickled down to Bhaskar, to be completely and totally honest. Not that Bhaskar doesn't have money. He was born fairly wealthy, but it's not been cultivated in the same way. And I say this as a person who was on the right in my 20s. This didn't happen to me, but I know plenty of people who were cultivated, taken care of, specifically because they were working class people, who maybe had a slightly conservative temperament. Maybe they served in the Iraq War. Maybe because they served in the Iraq War, they had some access to some state senator or whatever. Might even be talking about the actual life story of J.D. Vance and the parts that's not in his book. But there's a whole infrastructure and ecosystem that cultivates talent. On the left, even on the Democratic Party adjacent parts of the left, there really isn't the same infrastructure. Mm-hmm. We have had to rely on crowdfunding and whatnot for forever. If we get NGO money, it tends to have a more corrupting influence on us. And for me, it actually leads me to a question, because when people say there's no money on the left, I'm like, well, there isn't, but there also is, which is a very strange thing to say, right? What I mean by that is, if you're a leftist content creator or thinker, you're going to have to figure out a way to support yourself. Yeah. If, however, you look at, like, say, the Democratic Party's power base, they're not interested in even cultivating young liberals. Like, they pretty much leave that up to, say, the ACLU or anything like, or something like some traditional NGO, the Sierra Club, something like that. And even those places do not have the money that they used to have. So even though, say, the average, like on average, the Democratic voter is richer than they have historically been, that money does not trickle into the infrastructure, even for like Think Progress, and much less for something like the DSA. One of the things I was amazed at, I have a lot of complaints about the DSA, and I'm not going to go into them here, but I've actually looked at their money, because the DSA is fairly transparent about that stuff, and I'll give it credit for that. I can find it. It's not easy to find, but it is publicly available, even if you're not a member. And they have less money than you think they would. Honestly, yeah.
They do better when, like, someone like Bernie runs. Like, they do a lot better. Like, membership goes up and whatnot. And of course, the right literally like plays that one convention video where they're trying to say everyone's a they them or whatever. Like, it's like, I'm like, not it. DSA is like not a monolith. Like the more metropolitan areas, DSA chapters do far better. You know, my local chapter does a lot of mutual aid, driving people to the polls, voter registration, and of course they read theory occasionally, but they do a lot of mutual aid. Like they do what they can to not seem as scary to, like, you know, the conservatives in the area.
That's interesting. So my experience with urban DSAs in red states, and I'm being specific here, though, I am talking about urban DSAs, they tend to actually be more radical than the big DSA. That I don't mean in the they them.
Oh yeah, like
sense.
we've had like people from like Memphis DSA and like Louisiana come in. They're like full blown like communists, and I'm like, whoa, you guys are a little bit too radical for DSA. They're like, no, it's the only place where we feel like comfortable and safe to express our beliefs. I'm like, well, that's good to know. Here, go
It was actually interesting. So Freedom Road Fight Back, I believe, one of the more democratic centralist / militant of the Freedom Road Maoist associations, and there's two of them. I think one of them changed their name. It's very confusing, but they actually liquidated into the DSA here. And so our DSA did fun stuff like decolonize this name, so it's not Democratic Socialist of America of Salt Lake, it's Democratic Socialist of Salt Lake, which is harmless, but
people
is
will
also
melt down over it.
Yeah, it's harmless. It also is fairly meaningless, but I bring that up because it's interesting to see the dynamics at play. Whereas if you're in New York, there are 50 different left-wing chapters of a whole variety of militancy that have establishments there, that have had establishments there, some of them since the 1920s. I mean, like,
yeah.
I think the other thing that we've seen is the rise of the CPUSA again, which for people who are older, remember them as, we made fun of them because they always told everybody to just vote for the Democrats, even though they don't endorse anybody, but that's effectively what they do. And they would even, in 2016, they did fun things like oppose Bernie as an ultra leftist. That was fun. But since 2019, their demographic has really changed, and they've done a lot and developed, actually doing worker organizing. And I think that's partly because the DSA's brand, and I was talking to David Griscom about this, and we kind of went back and forth on this, but I was like, the DSA's brand right now is in a hard place because on one hand, it's trying to change the Democrats and oppose the Democratic establishment. But on the other hand, it's also trying to remain within that establishment. And it's a hard thing to do. I am skeptical that it'll work, but I'm not here to push you on that today. But I am interested about that position as the Democrats' brand becomes more toxic, which it clearly is right now. So, what are your thoughts on that? How do people feel about? How do you feel about the Democrats, Kristina?
They suck. I mean, they're not as bad as Republicans, but they suck. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, it feels like, when I was a kid, and so this is an old thing, this goes back to the Clinton years, but we would talk about how the Democrats were the party of no ideas and the Republicans were the party of bad ideas. Yeah. And now it feels like the Democrats are the Democrats are the party of shrug, and the Republicans are the party of burn it all down.
Yes.
Like this is just kind of,
conquer and destroy, and Democrats are like, meh.
Why do you think it is? Like, why do you think they're so blind to this stuff?
I honestly have no idea. I have no idea. They're just, I don't know why. They're so afraid to do anything. They just don't want to tiptoe around because they're afraid of what the Republicans will do. And I'm like, well, you're not doing anything and they're doing a lot. So they're not going to care whether you do something. Just do it. Like, what do you got left to lose?
Yeah, they're going to demonize you either way, right?
Yeah. We need a strong Republican Party. They're not gonna be like, they're not gonna say we need Democrats. No, they're like, we need to abolish all Democrats. Like,
but then that also means that puts me in an interesting trajectory though, in what the DSA should do, because from the Tea Party forward, the Republican right has always been willing to knock down, drag out fight with the Republican establishment. I do not feel like the Democratic Socialists or the progressives have ever been willing to do that. And what makes me leery about that is watching that happen several cycles since I was a kid, since
the same thing happening over and over again.
Yeah, and it works. It works. Like, and so part of me is like, why? I don't know that it would work for us. So I'm gonna caveat that, like, but why don't we go harder at mainstream Democrats than we do? I mean, yeah, we all complain about how much they suck, but like, we're not threatening to primary them in a purple state.
Yeah.
The way that the Tea Partiers will. They'll lose Georgia for one round to win the battle of their party.
Yeah. I mean, Republicans do a lot of terrible things while in office and power. Then Democrats come in, and what do? They don't do anything. They say they're going to do something, they don't. And then people are unhappy with the Democrats, so then they vote for the Republicans, and again, the same thing happens over and over and over again with little change or difference.
It has been a pattern since Carter.
Yeah.
That my entire life. It's interesting. I was thinking about today, Lyndon Johnson, personally probably quite a dickbag, and politically a disaster because of Vietnam, but he would destroy people who got in the way of his progressive agenda. And I'm like,
they sell BJ.
Yeah, and I'm just like, I don't know.
I would be like, stay, like, Ms. McConnell, come. No, sir. Get the hell away from me. I'm passing this whether you like it or not. If you don't like it, get the fuck out of my like I would be a bitch.
I mean, if they were serious, they would be primary in Manchin, even though they know they're probably going to lose West Virginia if they do so.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, because it's just like, well, you're not going to keep the House and Senate anyway. So, at this point, like, when you see the statistics, why don't you punish him? And they're not. So
nope.
It's like, and that's not. It's not just Manchin. I mean, it's also Cinema,
Cuellar.
Yeah, there's
the only Democrat, by the way, to vote against the Women's Health Act or whatever it's called. The only Democrat to vote against it in the House. We all, and even before they said it was Henry Cuellar, I'm like, it was Cuellar, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's Cuellar. I mean, of course it was, right?
Like, it was. The guy who votes with Trump 75%, who's probably the only really, like, he's more pro-Trump as a Democrat than even Joe Manchin is.
Oh, for sure.
He's more corrupt. He's voted for him like 75% of the time on legislation. He's pro-NRA, pro-gun, anti-choice. I'm like, what was the point in re-electing him? And there's been articles of Democrats sending a mixed message when it comes to the issue of abortion because of this and the fact they're not doing anything else.
Well, I mean, what don't they send a mixed message on? I mean, one other thing I would say, somebody was, bemoaning Manchin killing the Democrats' climate legislation, which to be frank,
it's not good.
Yeah, I was like, the climate legislation itself was a joke, but Manchin has for sure killed it. And then I'm like, but Manchin's killed and continues to kill pretty much anything he wants to.
Even if it's his own legislation, he's like, never mind, I don't like this.
I mean, the inflation justification makes sense for some things, but not for a lot of it. And I mean, I don't believe the inflation is why he's doing it. I think he's doing it to stay in power in West Virginia. But it's an interesting problem, and I think another friend of mine had me thinking about this the other day. Is there's been a pretty large exodus of people during COVID out of the cities. They're too expensive. People be able to telecommute in.
Some people are leaving the country itself.
I've done that a few times.
Must be
but
nice.
You have to get a job to do it.
Yeah. I literally had a friend who said she was like a very like conservative like activist type when she was young, but like she moved to Sweden, I believe, for a boyfriend, and she got radicalized because she was like, Kristina, I get free healthcare. And the only reason why taxes are higher is because of goods like electronics and clothing. But I'd rather not pay money for health care or education and get affordable housing. I was like, see, it's the lived experience that helps people, see things in a different way. Even my sister, when she would travel, she's like, I got sick. I went to the pharmacy and they gave me a prescription for cold medicine for like not even $1. And I'm like,
pretty much everywhere I've been on Earth, medical, even places that actually don't have socialized insurance, medical care has been way more affordable.
And it's so funny because I remember when Natasha Richardson died from her ski accident, Liam Neeson's wife, and everyone's like, well, it was the Canadian healthcare system that killed her. She had to wait and wait and wait for hours in the ER. I'm like, no, she refused care initially. And then it was too late. We have people in America waiting for hours, 12 hours in the ER and haven't been seen by a doctor yet. Don't try to tell me that the Canadian healthcare system is to blame when our healthcare system is just as bad, if not worse.
It's what's amazing about our healthcare system is you have the same wait times. I've actually had worse wait times in my personal experience. And I would know, I've been hospitalized in many countries. Don't get typhoid, but just as a little advice, don't get typhoid. But if you do get typhoid, don't get it in America, because if you get it in another place where you're slightly more likely to get it, you can probably get it treated.
Varn.
Yeah. But it was actually amazing to me, even in Mexico. Now, the Mexican socialized medicine sucks. But that's kind of unique to Mexico. It's because the way they funded it is to not fund it at all. They created a system that they have doctors working it to pay off their state paid education. And it actually does do some good things. Doctors are more integrated in the community, but since they don't really fund it, at least they didn't very much. It has very low funding. It's pretty much just the labor that they put in there. It's kind of crappy, but Mexican healthcare is, other than that, actually quite good. And people who tell you otherwise usually don't know what they're talking about. When
I always ask people, I'm like, have you had actual experiences in like these healthcare systems? And they're like, always no. But I'm like, no.
Well,
you
also
don't have the experience.
Statistically, my argument's always been quite simple. Even before I was a Marxist, statistically speaking, the U.S. costs the most, both to the individual and the government. What I just think people don't realize that the government here, because they have to do tax reimbursements and lose revenue based off all the indigent care that's done, it never gets paid for, but people still owe as debt. And because there's incentives for that to be jacked up in price so that they can sell the debt to recoup some of the costs. So, for example, even if your insurance doesn't cover your bill, if you've ever gotten a bill pre-insurance versus post-insurance, you'll know your bill will drop automatically just by having insurance, even if your insurance doesn't cover it.
Yeah.
So there's that. But the government actually spends more in these tax rebates off of indigent care than they would if they just socialized the damn thing. And we have this incredibly elaborate and strange and expensive insurance servicing sector that's like most of the hospitals. And right now, we're discovering, after 3 years of a pandemic, they're basically cracking. Now, the pandemic has broken some healthcare and in places with socialized medicine too. That's not the only vector that matters, but to me, this is like proof positive that this doesn't work, which is why immediately I was discouraged when, as soon as Joe Biden won, Medicare for all was removed from the table, like instant.
A lot of progressive policies were removed from the table.
And I honestly think if you're going to complain about, and I think we should be angry about people like Jimmy Dore. But I think we do have to admit that like Jimmy Dore's opening was legitimate frustration with shit like that. Yeah. Like no, I always thought the forced vote was silly because like, of course the American people know that the Democrats are full of shit. You don't have to have another vote to prove that.
Yeah, and also too, a lot of these Medicare for all people have kind of abandoned Medicare for all and went down the anti-vax, health, freedom, choice, whatever, like is going like that kind of little subset of like the grift is going on. I'm like, because Ryan Grimm was discussing this on the Majority Report with Sam and Emma, and I was like, oh yeah, I've noticed that these medical freedom people used to be like pro Medicare for all types. But now they went anti-vax and are about medical freedom, but still are kind of wanting limitations on abortion. It's weird.
Well, I mean, it became clear to me that if their criticisms were real, and look, there are plenty of criticisms to be had, even of the squad, right? Yeah. There have been times where, unfortunately, I've listened to Jimmy Dore and be like, well, when you started this, I agree with you. And then somewhere there was a twist where you were basically like pushing strange LaRouchian ideas on me. But the issue that you have is that people, a lot of these ideological movements, it seems pretty clear that the way to differentiate yourself is to move right without saying you're going to move right. And I was talking to a friend of mine about this because conservatism, properly speaking, is still not super popular as a brand amongst people under 45.
Yeah.
However, that doesn't mean conservative attitudes aren't beginning to creep up from a mixture of some people becoming wealthy, but they're getting branded weirder and weirder ways. And I think that should be concerning because a lot of people can basically now hold conservative beliefs without saying so.
Yeah.
And conversely, I mean, I'm not a liberal, so, a lot of people also hold liberal beliefs without saying so because they are also unpopular. But what that really just is rebranding. It's not a great realignment. Yeah. It's rebranding. And so I think we're going to have that issue in the future to deal with, and it's going to make it harder to get a lot done.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's depressing. So how did you get into political media? Like, what pushed you into the political media sphere?
Well, my father died of cancer last year, and I was like, I gotta do something to help me grieve, and I discovered Twitch, and I was like, let me just sit around my camera and talk, because therapy can be expensive. And so I've always been involved. I'm friends with Anna of TYT, and I know Nomiki, and I know like different leftist media figures. And I was like, I could stream on Twitch, and yeah. Like my stream is political, but it's also very chill, relaxing, safe community. We try not to like cause no trouble or anything like that.
So what makes a chill political space? Because it doesn't. One thing I wanted to talk to you about actually is, with some exceptions, it's actually hard to get women on a far left media show.
Yeah,
and a lot of that has to do with our audience. Honestly. Yeah. I've noticed it. I've seen it. I've seen the way it goes. I'm actually now reluctant to live stream with a female guest because I have to monitor the chat so much more.
They're like, oh,
yeah.
woman. Ooh, well, I mean, I wasn't wearing a good thing because I usually wear fancy, cheap ass dresses. So I was like, I'm gonna wear something casual.
But I've actually been fascinated by that. TYT and Majority Report actually, for all my criticisms of some of their politics, and I have kind of, I feel like I've been making fun of Shane Huger for 20 years. But Anna Kasparian, I have liked sometimes a lot. I think she was the first blue check to follow me on Twitter, which actually confused the shit out of me.
You probably tweeted something that she liked.
Probably, although you know me through Forrest, but I have a reputation for being a shit flinger.
I didn't know that.
Well, I tend to be very nice in person, and I tend to try to not attack people on Twitter. And I do
do that, and almost drove me crazy, so I stopped doing it. So when people try to come at me, I just go bloop.
Yeah. I don't attack people, but I do attack ideas. And I don't have a problem with leftist infighting as long as you know that there is a line, and that line to me is, are you backing up enemies against leftists? Or the other line is, do you take right-wing money? Like those two things are disqualifying for me. Like, you take right-wing money, you're out. Like,
yeah,
there's been a couple of times where I'm ambivalent about it. There have been a few people where I have been where I've understood the situation, but it still doesn't sit well with me. But in general, that's the cutoff line. And the other line is, would you help a rightist to get it over on another leftist? If you do that, you're out. Like, you don't do, like, we can fight amongst ourselves, but it's kind of like siblings. Like, yeah, we can fight amongst ourselves, but when someone from the outside attacks you, you better line up. Like, and so that's kind of my attitude about it. As I've gotten older, I've also adopted this thing that I took from Michael Brooks, and Michael found me a bit too radical. Actually, he said that to me to my face. Didn't cut any bones about it.
Michael always I think he knew that I had a crush on him because I'd always tag him, talk about how much I loved him so much, and he would always respond with hearts and stuff like that. I feel like Michael would have been the millennials and Gen Z's Chomsky, because he was willing to go on anybody's podcast, anybody's stream, interview, whatever. He always liked talking to people.
Well, yeah, I mean, actually, before I was really well established, Michael Brooks came on my show, and what's funny is he asked to come on my show. I was a very tiny show at the time.
Oh.
What he was trying to do, and we had disagreements on a lot of things, but what he was trying to do was to at least build enough bridges between different kinds of leftists that they could be in dialogue with one another and start to come up with something approaching a viable politics, so we didn't have to rely on conventional Democrats all the time, or like me, be in the complete political wilderness and have no one to represent us at all. And while Brooks and I had some very different ideas, we had very different interpretation of Marxism, there's two things that we would talk about a lot. One was being not attacking people personally over political issues, unless you thought they were selling you out to the right. But you needed a really strong demarcation line for that. Sometimes it led to Michael being soft on people maybe in the future that we know from the future that maybe you shouldn't have been, like Amy Therese. But most of the time that was the right instinct. And so I started adopting that as well. Look, I might be a sectarian, but we need to have a big tent. We need to be able to talk to people. I mean, if you can't talk to other leftists, how the fuck are you going to talk to anybody else, right? Like,
Yeah, we're a joke.
Yeah. So that was a big thing I took from him. And the other thing was if you can be ruthless to ideas part of that, but again, don't personalize it. Like, don't go after a person when you're mad at a thought.
Yeah.
And so I kind of try to live by that. And so it is interesting because sometimes my Twitter feed is a bunch of people who kind of hate each other, but are all ostensibly leftist. And that's always fun.
Yeah,
But
I say I have it.
Happens a lot. But one thing I noticed a while back when we talked about this leftist media sphere is outside of like the streamers, there aren't a lot of women. It's a very bro dominated sphere, and on top of that,
it's mostly made of white people too.
Yeah, it's a very white bro dominated sphere, and I think on top of that, even more so, in a way that I think is interesting, the behavior that we encourage, like leftist women who are popular on media spheres, has led to what I like to call red scare behavior, which is trying to outbro the bros. And usually that ends up taking a kind of weirdly quasi right-wing feel in the way it happens. And structurally that makes sense, right? Like that's what you're setting up with that environment. Like, and for all that I sometimes like make fun of Seek Weaker, there is a sense in which like the progressive media sphere has been better at that than the left media sphere, and I don't know why. I mean, I do know why, but it's because the progressives have been at it longer, they're more aware, and it's less of an ideological identification thing a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But do you get a lot of pushback on your streams from dudes? Are you able to manage that?
I'm able to, I have mods in my chat who take care of everything. I always get asked if I'm a dude. Like, I get a lot of transphobia, which is what a lot of us cisgendered women deal with too on Twitch. It's, for people who don't know what cisgender means, they always can tell. But I feel like, I get, compliments, which is, nice compliments. I get cheesy pickup lines. They're like, hey, just funny. But I'm doing this as like a fun introduction. I'm not here to be a creep. I'm like, cool. But then I get the DMs and I'm like, oh, great.
Yeah. DM etiquette's actually interesting because I think I'm gonna out myself as I've already out myself as old, but as an old, it's something that I've had to learn mainly by being in this media sphere, because I'm like, oh, people confuse DMs with dating. Got it.
Yeah.
That's gross. So yeah, I imagine that happens. Does it happen as much as I think it does? Because it feels like.
I mean, for me, it's not as bad as like when like Amaranth and all the other like not even like leftist Twitch streamers, but like the female ones, like the ones who dominate Twitch, like, but their content is very on the border of like not safe for work / safe for work, like whatever Twitch allows.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, I'm just here to chill and chat and be me.
So, okay, I'm going to say this as a person who went on Twitch, did this, and for my listeners who might be listening to this, this is me waving my hands wildly, and immediately gave up and went to YouTube. Because I was drag kicking and screaming into YouTube because I'm a podcaster. I'm long form. But I did find streaming for a while to be very particularly in the height of pandemic, to be very relieving. There was a point, however, for me, where it changed and I started to hate my audience.
Oh no, mine was great, but that's because I network with other streamers. I'm friends with so many different streamers, so I get a lot of their community into my chat. So it's like, hey, this person knows that person, and that person knows this person, and oh my god, like people are like, hey, how are you? Hey, what's up? Oh, I didn't know you watch her, like stuff like that. And I'm like, yeah.
So that's interesting. So you would say it kind of replicates like maybe early social media dynamics in some ways.
Yeah. Thank God. Like I even say people, I'm like, if you start fighting, I'm gonna ban you. I don't care. No fights in chat.
No fights in chat.
Nope.
See, this is smart, but what I tend to do is the opposite. I tend to fight with my chat, which is probably it encourages both sides to have Stockholm syndrome, probably.
Yeah, probably.
But it's interesting. I do think that tone difference is actually kind of important, I think, for why there's not a lot of female engagement in like far left media.
Yeah.
Like
I mean, the problem is also too, a lot of some of the female ones are just right wingers who said that they are leftists, like Lauren Southern and Kim Iverson and those types. But I mean, there's a lot of good. There are good. I mean, there's Ravana. There is Amy CE3. There's Polly Peoples, a trans woman Twitch streamer. There's the Progressive Brat. She's amazing. Who else is there? Tina_2. Like, there's quite a few of them out there. And I do apologize for those that I did not name.
Well, I think I discovered Ravana because PYT plus overlap with Forrest and a lot of the Jacobin media crew.
Yeah.
And everybody else you mentioned, I'm like, I need to go look that up because I have no idea what that is.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting confluence of worlds, though, and I think one of the things I've been dealing with as the more I've been in left media, and I've been in left media in the podcast realm for fucking a decade, and what I've seen is like now there's so many, and this is not bad. This is just something I'm noticing. There's so many different like little community media spheres that are kind of niche media spheres that you can be very inculcated in one discourse set and have no idea that there's like a parallel discourse set with people just slightly younger and slightly different from you somewhere else. I mean, for me, one of the big things I try to do, when I worked for Zero Books, I always used to complain about like how we were like super duper white. And then we started working with TIR, and that immediately changed the dynamic. For me, what it led to was a growth in my female audience, and then a growth of my audience of color in America. Now, because I lived abroad for 10 years, had a pretty large and diverse audience, but in the United States, it was mostly college-educated philosophy nerds.
Yeah.
And they have a tendency to be either white or South Asian. And that trend immediately changed when I started going on TIR semi-regularly. And so I also started noticing that and thinking about that in regards to like reaching out to younger people and women. Now my audience is younger than me, like probably by about a decade.
Yeah, my audience ranges from like they have to be 18 to like 80.
I don't have a lot of 80-year-olds either.
Oh god, the 80-year-old dude, he's cool. He's like, I was a swinger in my days. Here's the story of me. I had a threesome with this guy and this chick, and I'm like, you go, sir. Like, he's like, that's how I stay young.
Well,
I'm like, yeah, keep up with the times. He's like, I tell people, they're like, I'm old. I'm like, no one's old in my chat, in my community. No one's old, okay? We're all young here.
If I had anything, I'd probably do the opposite. I'm like, we're all old. Like, it doesn't matter what age you are. You're old now. But yeah, it's that's why I'm on YouTube. YouTube is for the old. No, that's if I really wanted to double down on that, I could have stayed on LiveJournal.
Oh God.
Yeah, it was like that particular social media probably died before you were an adult. So.
Oh, I remember. I remember Friendster. I remember all of like. I was on the computer by the time I was like 10 years old, so
that's true.
Idea.
Computers got a lot cheaper in the late 90s.
Yeah.
I remember sneaking onto the library to get on the computer when I was in high school, but I guess that's really just a how old I am thing.
Yeah.
We had a computer in the house, but it was
landline.
Oh yeah, everything was landline. Like it used to when I first got on the internet, it took an hour to download a picture.
Yeah, I know. The only thing my grandmother can get was AOL. That's it. That's the only thing she can get. It costs $60,000 to get like Breeze Line here. But we're getting fiber, AT&T fiber in this apartment. So I'm like, woohoo. My streaming's going to be off the chain. Do people still say that? No, probably not.
Probably not. But you're still young, so you can get away with it, I guess.
Hey, the first ringtone I ever had was Chain Hang Low.
Fair enough. So you do a movie podcast. A movie. It's actually not a podcast. It's a movie YouTube channel and Twitch stream and a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah.
It's how have you liked doing that? It's funny because we were both on the same show a fair amount, but I have never been on a show with you. So
yeah. Oh, it's great. I'm a movie buff, so like any excuse to watch a movie, and I get to talk about it. I'm like, woohoo! I got Forrest to watch the Suicide Squad. He liked it. Because we did that
Suicide Squad, not Suicide Squad.
No, the good one.
Yeah, the good one. Okay.
Yeah.
It's confusing because it's like, okay, so you made a sequel that's really a soft reboot, but it has the same name with just the difference of an article.
But and I'm trying to get him to watch Multiverse of Madness.
So how do you feel about Marvel movies?
Oh, I like Marvel and DC. I think a lot of people are just not into this new phase because they're confused with the universe and the multiverse and the variants and stuff like that. I'm like, if you watch the shows like WandaVision and Loki, you would like it. But people are like, I have to watch this in order to understand this movie. I'm like, I guess you're not a Marvel fan then? Like, of course you have to. You have to watch everything in order.
It does seem like it's interesting because I think the DC movies are getting better. And
and the shows too. Harley Quinn and Peacemaker. Black Canary's gonna have her own film, I think.
The first sign that I saw that things were improving in DC world was Birds of Prey, which is an underrated movie.
I love Birds of Prey.
I feel like it got lost just because of the pandemic. Otherwise, we'd have been talking about it changing the trajectory of the DC movies.
There's a lot of film guys on YouTube who are like, here's why Birds of Prey is actually a masterpiece. And I'm like, hell yeah.
Yeah, Birds of Prey is actually quite good. I thought it was one, it's a pretty good use of the Harley Quinn character, and two, it's
like how she sees DC. Like it's gritty, but also there's bits of color in there.
Yeah, it's a fun movie. I recently saw The Batman. I feel like every 10 years they get a new Batman reboot, and then
this one, I feel like people, if they watch the animated series, they would understand this Batman movie more because it's very detective Batman.
yeah, it actually, that's a good analog. It feels like the non-Frank Miller 80s and 90s comics too.
Yeah.
I liked it. I did not think it was great. I thought it was a little overlong, but I actually did. I liked Detective Batman. I missed Detective Batman. We haven't seen Detective Batman.
Yeah.
It's something different than Dark Gritty Batman or Joe Schumacher Batman. So it's like
That credit card guy?
oh man, Nolan. I also think the Nolan movies are overrated, but I've thought that for a decade. Like I've gone back and rewatched them, and I don't get their politics or really what they're trying to say. And it's one of these things where at the time we all thought it was profound, and I go back and rewatch it. I'm like, what is this actually? Like, it feels like, the last one is just a swipe at Occupy Wall Street, but
I did like what was great about the Suicide Squad is that it did have like a leftist, take it out like anti-imperialistic messaging, and I'm like, yeah. I was just here for Margot Robbie, but hell yeah. I'm excited for the Barbie movie too. I don't care what people say. That film's gonna be great.
The Barbie movie?
Yep, Barbie movie. Margot Robbie, Ryan Gosling. It's gonna be great.
Oh, okay.
Greta Gerwig's directing it because you know it's gonna be good if she's directing it.
I'm trying to think. Is there a bad Greta Gerwig movie? I don't really totally think so. There's a lot of mumbly Greta Gerwig movies, but there's not a bad one.
Yeah.
No, that's interesting. Actually, that means it's going to be meta AF if Greta Gerwig is directing it.
Yeah.
I just did. It'll come out. So for those of you who are watching, this is pre-recorded. I'm going to out that. But I think this will still come out before it comes out on the podcast, and it's just a podcast. They did a long thing on female movie directors, and I didn't actually cover Greta Gerwig because we didn't do Hollywood adjacent ones. We did early ones, mostly from the LA Rebellion movement, and which was a movement of Black filmmakers in the 70s. Produced produced two different prominent Black filmmakers who had black women filmmakers who had very interesting careers, but got relegated. One died, unfortunately. She just died young at 42, I think. She died in the 90s. And it's Catherine Collins. And the other, Julie Dash, got relegated to Lifetime movies. So it's interesting to go back and remember that the first Black woman director with a theatrical release movie in the United States was not until 1991.
Yeah.
Just and I did a list of movies that were directed by women in the 20th century, and there's a bunch in the silent period, and then there's not a lot until the 90s. It's a long time. The ones that do exist tend to be mostly from France. I don't know why that's the case, but it is.
Yeah.
So that was that. But Greta Gerwig, let's see, what Greta Gerwig movies have I seen?
Lady Bird?
Yes, I've seen Lady Bird.
Yeah, we're thinking of doing a teen theme month, where we discuss popular teen movies of our generations and whatnot, like The Breakfast Club and
So that would be J. Andrew World's generation. Yes, go on.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Conan is also in his 40s, so he would also probably be considered when it comes to The Breakfast Club and whatnot. I'm trying to think of maybe
Dazed
singles,
and Confused and Singles.
There are. I'm trying to think of teen movies from the 90s that were influential.
Singles and Reality Bites.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Singles and Reality Bites.
There's a bunch of aughts or late 90s, early aughts romantic comedies that could count.
Yeah, I know Mean Girls would be considered a teen movie.
Yeah, but it's funny because I would put Mean Girls and Forrest's generation.
Yeah,
like
it's
like I was in my 20s when that came out.
I was like, oh man, I am 11 years old. What can go wrong? And I was like, oh crap, high school is like this.
Yeah, it kind of is. There's a bunch. I mean, the thing is, 80s has a ton of teen movies. A lot of them are bad and we've forgotten them, and then others
are like John Hughes
movies, and we haven't forgotten them, even though their politics is all kinds of weird.
Yeah.
But there's a Breakfast Club, there's Pretty in Pink, there's all those
16
movies.
Candles.
16 Candles, Weird Science.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of them. And
there's also the one from 1990 called Mermaid, starring Cher and Winona Ryder. And that's really good, like, coming of age for like a young teen girl who's kind of sex obsessed and is curious. Yes, she's also Catholic, and it's just weird.
Mermaids and Heathers actually would also be good, but again, I consider that's a Gen X thing. Still.
Yeah, but even then, like with the oh god, Heather's made into a musical. I think like a lot of these movies are being made into musicals, so a new generation of audiences is getting like introduced to these films.
It's interesting. It's interesting also the reactions that you had to them. Like, so I think about Revenge of the Nerds, which as a kid I liked, but I did not understand. And even when I watched it in my 20s, I was like, whoa, this is rapey.
Yeah. Yeah. Some stuff hasn't aged well. I mean, like there's other teen movies that came out in like the mid 2000s, like also like Juno, obviously. They've already covered Scott Pilgrim versus the World on Movie Night Extravaganza. But I'm gonna look up famous teen movies, and we'll have to narrow them down.
So, yeah, there's a ton. I feel like a lot of the ones in the 90s are actually set in the 70s too. But that's a whole different thing because we had that weird 70s nostalgia, which is like 90s nostalgia now.
Yeah.
Had this realization a few years ago that like there was a greater distance between the 80s and now than there was between the 80s and the early 90s and the 50s.
Yeah.
It'd be like if we were still listening to 40s music.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting scenario. What's your favorite teen movie?
Oh god, my favorite teen movie is definitely The Breakfast Club.
So you like you like The Breakfast Club, huh?
Yep, and also too, I mean, I'm a fan of like older stuff, so like I love music from the '60s. So.
Baby boomer propaganda. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting because Conan and I are both in that weird gap period between Gen X and Millennial. So, because you can be I think the oldest Gen Xers are almost in their 60s now.
Yeah, I'm a millennial.
Yeah, you would be on the young end of millennial.
Yeah.
Well, I would be an elder thing, Zennial. So.
Yeah, pretty much.
So it's very strange. I mean, there isn't a whole. I mean, what's interesting about Gen Xers is Gen X leftists seem to have all come into existence recently, because I feel like until for a very long time, I'm like, well, if you go to a left meeting, for example, this was pre-DSA Renaissance, it would be like two old trots in their 60s or 70s, and then a bunch of millennials. And that'd be it.
Yeah.
But yeah. So, what's the favorite movie you guys have covered on the show?
I love that we've covered Black Swan and also Nightmare on Elm Street and the Suicide Squad. I think Nightmare on Elm Street one was the first one I ever appeared on. Oh, also Blue Velvet, because I got to finally meet Anna.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I love all those movies. The Nightmare on Elm Street movies are kind of... I think the first one's a legitimate classic. Those movies actually get weirder and weirder as they go on.
Yeah, when it comes to like the major horror franchises like Halloween and Friday the 13th, I feel like Nightmare on Elm Street ones have like the least worst sequels.
Oh yeah. Like, and you have to get to like Freddy versus Jason or Freddy's Dead for them to suck, and even then, you have Wes Craven's New Nightmare to sneak in there and redeem it.
Yes.
Whereas like Halloween gets bad like in 2 movies. Like Hellraiser, there's 2 good ones. There's only 2 good ones. Like
I always have a soft spot for Nightmare on Elm Street 5 just because I like the kills in that one.
Which one's that?
The one where Freddy is like the father of Alice's baby.
Oh yeah. That's actually pretty good.
Yeah.
I think, like, thinking back on it, they're all pretty decent. 1 and 2 are great. Three is
Like
3 is great in a completely different way. I mean, Dream Warriors is wild.
Yeah.
6, meh, but
I have a friend who has her own podcast who had Robert Englund on to discuss the Phantom of the Opera film he did like back in '89, and I'm gonna message her and be like, can you give me Robert Englund's contact info, because I would love to have him on a movie podcast. He'll do all the talking though, because he likes to talk a lot.
Yeah, I've always been interested in interviewing Kurt Russell for similar reasons, even though I know he's like at least he was like a pretty strong right winger. So what are you gonna do? And then what I've always found interesting actually about horror is horror has a reputation for being reactionary, but when you look at the directors, most of them are leftist or at least liberals. Wes Craven, Cronenberg. Well, I mean, Cronenberg's kind of an art house director by the 90s.
Hitchcock.
Yeah.
Peele.
Oh yeah, definitely Peele. I'm trying to think. Carpenter is actually pretty left wing, actually.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting because I'm always like, we always talk about how reactionary these movies are, but I'm like, their directors kind of weren't, or we don't remember them. Like the more memorable ones are,
or we don't really think of their politics
like at all. Yeah. Yeah, because I'm like, I don't know the politics of like who directed Friday the 13th 5 or like. I don't even think I remember who that is. So it is interesting though. I mean, there is a real sense in which like the slasher genre is kind of reactionary, but
but we've had some creative like slasher movies like Ready or Not, for instance. Like, I love that film.
Did you like X?
Yes.
Yeah, I love. I have yet to see a bad Ty West movie. So, see what you know what's actually stayed pretty good. The Scream franchise has stayed pretty good. There's only one bad one, really.
Yeah, despite like Wes Craven like not being here, I'm wondering because they've been debating whether or not to bring back Nightmare on Elm Street. I'm like, please, just as long as the Freddy makeup is like Vetka, like authentic real makeup and not CGI, it could happen. But Robert Englund's like, I'm too old. I'm like, yeah, but like you have to appear. You have to make a cameo. It won't be the same without you. I know you're 70-something years old, but come on, Robert.
It is interesting. That's the only one that hasn't been relaunched.
No. Halloween has, like, Scream obviously has, but like...
Even Texas Chainsaw Massacre has been relaunched twice.
And this is the reason why, is because Freddy Krueger is a personality, is a game show host. You know,
Yeah,
people
that's true.
tie Robert Englund to that role, and no other person could portray Freddy Krueger like Robert Englund. My opinion, I think Dan Stevens could probably pull it off. He's even like, everyone says Kevin Bacon. I'm like, Kevin Bacon's starting to get up there in age. They need someone young.
Yeah.
I mean, they're even going to do the It prequel. You know, Bill Skarsgård is going to be playing Pennywise again, because only he can do that role.
That's true. I've been interested in this King Renaissance.
Yeah.
Actually, because it does seem, I blame it mostly on Mike Flanagan, but it's been interesting to see. It's interesting because, to me, 70s King is one of the few horror writers who is interested in working class characters. That changes actually throughout his career, because he's often writing from his own standpoint. So later on, you get a lot of like, rich, drunk, offbeat, post-cocaine using writers. But in the 70s, you have a lot of really felt working class stuff, and that made a lot of good movies in the 80s. But then in the 90s, you had this saturation, and so during the aughts and during the torture torn period, King disappears. But recently, it just feels like it's been flooding back. And what's interesting,
you've had It, Pet Sematary, The Dark Tower.
The Dark Tower movie was bad.
Yeah, that was bad. I mean, Matthew McConaughey was fine, but the plot was bad. But like, I mean, I'm ready for them to redo Christine.
Yeah, I'm actually interested in why they haven't touched it. Where they haven't tried to redo Christine, because they've redone like iconic ones like Carrie, which, I mean, it's hard to beat the De Palma Carrie.
Yeah.
But, they haven't redone Christine. They haven't redone the Langoliers.
They haven't redone what is it? Oh God. What's it called? Streetwalkers? No.
Sleepwalkers?
Sleepwalkers, yeah. They haven't redid that one.
I mean, to be fair, they have redone The Shining, but we've all forgotten it.
And you know, the Dr. Sleep or whatever, that was really good.
Yeah, that was a movie that I actually don't understand why it didn't do better. And because one, Mike Flanagan set himself the task of reconciling the books to the Kubrick movie, which is damn near impossible.
Yeah, he fucking did it.
And two, it's a very well directed movie because I mean, Flanagan's not a particularly like flashy director, but he's a very competent one.
Yeah. And I guess because people were like, "Oh, are we going to see Jack Nicholson?" No, it's the kid from E.T.
That's fair.
Like, a lot of people were expecting to see like Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall, and I'm like, well, you can't see Shelley Duvall for obvious reasons, but like, it's a good tribute to the book and the movie,
which is really hard to do since Kubrick sort of didn't give a shit about the book.
Yeah, exactly. And Stephen King, he did not like it. He was like, "You gotta be fucking, this is not what I wrote, dude." Like,
yeah, he hates that movie. It's actually interesting because in some ways it is the best Stephen King adaptation, but it's also completely unfaithful to the material.
Yeah.
And in ways that I think are problematic, actually. And problematic in the sense that, like, the book is, I mean, The Shining, the book's actually really interesting in what it's trying to portray, and the whole dry drunk element of it, the tension there, and in the movie, Jack Nicholson is just fucking crazy. Like, there's it's from zero to crazy, and that's it. And so, you know, but yeah, I've loved I really like the first It, but the problem that I have with the new It is moving it it worked to move the first part from the 50s to the 80s, with some exception of the extremity of the homophobia and racism made a little bit less sense in the 80s.
Yeah. But why in 2017 it doesn't make sense.
Right. But when you move the 80s part to 2017, it falls apart. It's like,
yeah,
that don't feel real.
I'm like 2017 happened 2 years ago. What the hell? Like,
yeah, it's but I mean, I get why it'd been hard to set it in the.
But the casting was really well on who played who. Like when it came to kids versus adults, like the actors who played Eddie and Stan looked just like the adult versions of themselves, and I was like, whoa. And Ben too.
I do think that basically one of the things I think that happens from that is that it has replaced the TV movie as a canonical version, even if the second half is not great.
Yeah.
And I do sometimes wish they'd have done it the way it's done in the books, where you go back and forth between the 50s and the 80s or the 80s and now. But
yeah, almost kind of like what the miniseries did.
Yeah.
With every character remembering their like version of like what happened to them with the clown, like, and Tim Curry's phenomenal.
He is great in that movie. Well, that miniseries.
Yeah, I mean he you know, it's sad that he suffered a stroke and he's like does like cameos and like autographs and phone calls and stuff like that. But hey, you know, he's enjoying it, making money, I guess. But like, you know, I would ask him, be like, are you aware of the meme that says you can tell a person who they are by which Tim Curry movie they know you from? Like, I want to ask him that so bad, but it costs like $500, and it's like, oh,
that's an expensive cameo.
Yeah, like that. But I also like Bill Skarsgård interpretation because he's not making him like Pennywise like a person. He's more like making the it entity.
Yeah, he's more a force of nature, which is also pretty true to the book. And the weird spider monsters thing is believable now. So
yeah,
I mean, it's
I mean, Bill Skarsgård, he's a really good actor. Like everyone's like, oh, but he's his. I'm like, yeah, he's his dad, but he's also he could totally. If Steve Buscemi has a movie about his life, Bill Skarsgård has to play him. Because he looks like him.
Yeah. It's always, you know, it's always funny to me when you see that picture of like a young Steve Buscemi and he looks like Angelina Jolie. And then you're just like, age does weird things to people. Yeah, it's interesting. It's actually, but for me, I have lost faith in contemporary movie making, but I actually feel like post-COVID, even mainstream movies are slightly better, even if they're super fucking nostalgic, like this Maverick movie that came out.
Yeah.
To me, the pinnacle of like me getting annoyed was the last of the last Star Wars movies. It was like, oh my god, didn't even make sense.
The only good one that came out of that it was Rogue One.
Oh, actually, yeah, I really like Rogue One.
I was like, this is what Star Wars. This is the heart of Star Wars. Like, yes.
It's actually
Darth Vader's evil. Yes.
It's been interesting watching these TV shows because they're wildly uneven. Because like the Mandalorian season 1 and 2 starting to get season 2 are really interesting. The Book of Boba Fett was a mess, and you could tell they rewrote it 5 times.
Obi-Wan was pretty good because we also again got to see Darth Vader be ruthless.
My only issue.
The neck.
Yeah, well, that was intense. My only issue with that was just the power level up of Darth Vader. It was like, oh, he's somehow more powerful than he is later. But no, I actually thought that was decent.
And Hayden Christensen was able to actually be given good material, so he could act really well.
I feel like he was really underserved by the prequels are ambitious. I mean, I have this weird dialogue in my head. I don't love the prequels. I'm not one of those weirdos who like tries to defend them. You know, my introduction to Star Wars was The Empire Strikes Back in the theater. So when I was a very little kid,
my introduction was to prequels.
Yep. Well, the thing about the prequels though is they're conceptually ambitious. They're just pulled off really poorly. Like, and I also don't know why there's little alien Sambos throughout it. I don't get that. There's weird racial stereotypes as aliens all over the place in that one. In those movies particularly. But the problem I have with the current sequel round is they just don't make a lot of sense. Like trying to figure out how the world, like, how is the Alliance that weak when they won? What is the New Order? How is the Emperor hanging out on a planet with 50,000 clones of himself?
Yeah.
How did no one know that? Like, it's just it.
But
But
I'm also hoping that, like with Obi-Wan, we get like a Darth Vader miniseries that shows like Anakin like adjusting to being this, like, and how he got like powerful and whatnot. Because I feel like something like that's missing from the Star Wars lore.
Yeah. I guess my inclination is the more they move away from the main characters, the better they do. But the Obi-Wan actually is good enough that I'm like, okay, maybe you can handle it now. But like the Book of Boba Fett and the Han Solo movie were like, yeah, y'all need to write about other people in this universe. So there's that. But it's interesting. I also kind of am hoping they get something off Tatooine because I'm kind of tired of Tatooine.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's also interesting. So I guess we're going to be moving into the phase of the MCU where we get the X-Men, and I'm wondering what the hell they're going to do with that and how they're going to do it since they haven't been part of it this whole time.
I'm hoping, because Miss Marvel kind of, dropped the bomb on that one. I'm hoping that Noah Hawley gets involved, and we can bring back Dan Stevens as David Haller as Legion.
Oh, that'll be interesting. That would be interesting. I thought WandaVision was going to set it up, and they were going to like do the reverse of what Wanda did in the comic books, where she killed all the mutants. I figured maybe she'd accidentally bring them into existence.
Well, I'm hoping she does say no more mutants eventually. I'm like, come on, like it's, and people were so mad about her character arc in Multiverse of Madness. I'm like, people, she's
a lot worse than the comics.
Yeah, and also too, at the very end, like when we all think, oh yay, Wanda's, she's good, and, she's all cleared, she has the Darkhold, people. She's getting corrupted as she's reading it. I literally was like, oh shit, she's gonna be the villain in the next movie she's in, and that was Multiverse of Madness. So when people are like, it's so inconsistent with her character development, I'm like, no, it's not.
I got the feeling that I think the Multiverse of Madness stuff was originally supposed to come first, and then that would have made what happened in WandaVision make a little bit more sense. But and COVID screwed it up. But I may be wrong about that. I think I read that somewhere. So you wouldn't have her getting corrupted twice. But I think you got a point. I mean, but the thing is, like, she's such an awful. I mean, like, she basically genocides most of mutant kind.
No more mutants.
Yeah, so like it's hard. It's hard to be like, what did you think her character was like?
It would be great to bring back Sir Ian McKellen, because she wants him and not Michael Fassbender. I'm like, what you got against Michael Fassbender?
I think I think the characterization of the X-Men in all the Fox X-Men movies are pretty weird.
But don't talk about Apocalypse.
Do we acknowledge that happened?
No.
Like, or the Dark Phoenix saga? Do we acknowledge that happened?
No, we're not.
Yeah, those are bad. But I do think Fassbender is what saves those first class movies.
Yeah, because he's so good.
Yeah, he's excellent. But I love Ian McKellen too. But Fassbender is, it's like I love Christopher Lee, but I don't necessarily. I mean, he's dead, but I didn't necessarily need him in everything either because he's had a career of like, fuck, he was old when he was in the first Hammer Dracula film in the fucking 50s. Like,
yeah,
like come on now. similarly, Ian McKellen. I don't remember when Ian McKellen was young.
Yeah, I always it's same with oh god, what's her name? Maggie Smith. I don't remember her. I just see her as in Harry Potter, like in Downton Abbey. I see her as old. Like when I see young pictures of her, I'm like, oh, who's that?
Yeah, Angela Lansbury is another person that I've always known as old.
Yeah.
Apparently, she was hot at one point, and I'm like, okay, like I don't. That image is not in my head. I have Murder She Wrote in my head. She's still alive.
She just won a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Tonys.
Yeah, it's crazy. I'm like, oh, you're like almost Betty White age, kind of. That's another person I've always thought of as old.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting. I do think you have to clear it away for some new actors. I'm very interested in what they're going to do with the fact that they smash these universes together.
Yeah. Deadpool, let's go.
Oh boy. I think they're still having rights issues with Spider-Man.
Yeah, because Sony still owns Spider-Man. It's not like their universe is doing any good. It's Morbid time. Stars has streamed Spider-Man No Way Home, not Disney Plus.
Yeah, that's bizarre.
Yeah, because Sony is associated with Stars, so only Stars has the availability to stream No Way Home. And I'm like, God damn it.
It's weird because I'm also like, yeah, because like Spider-Man is in the MCU kinda, but the Spider-Verse is not. So Venom and all that isn't, and I also created weird problems with the Venom movie because it's in a Spider-Man-less universe.
Yeah, I actually have a friend who works in Marvel who was like, they actually came up with Spider-Man No Way Home even before Homecoming. Like they wrote most of the movies backwards, including Spider-Verse.
Huh.
I was like, cool. He's like, yeah, I've worked with Andrew Garfield. And I'm like, hey.
I did think it was interesting to formally put all the Spider-Man movies basically in universe now, but included like
everyone's like, the best MCU villain, sorry Thanos, is the Green Goblin. He's not even in the universe. And I'm like, I mean, it's Willem Dafoe. I mean, you can't. So,
yeah,
Willem Dafoe.
The MCU until the Vulture and then Thanos has had a villain problem. Which has actually been interesting because
we haven't really had a villain yet, like a main big bad for this phase.
Oh no, there's not. And there wasn't. I mean, when you think about it, there also isn't really main big bads for the first two phases. It's really only the phase 3 where you have a clear and interesting villain. Yeah. I guess Killmonger was also interesting, but he dies in the first. Yeah, that's the other problem. They kill the villains off too fast. So it's interesting to see where it's gonna go. I mean, the one thing that I think that I can say is that when they bring in interesting directors to the MCU, Kevin Feige eventually seems to win out. So
yeah. I feel like Multiverse of Madness definitely should have been rated R because Sam Raimi, that was it could have had the potential to be a really good, horror comic film.
Disney's not going to do that, but yeah, it would have been actually interesting. I actually wonder if they are about to do something like that. It's been...
Yeah, I mean, Deadpool, they're going to have to make rated R. They just cannot not.
So is Deadpool now in the universe?
He's probably going to be.
Oh, yeah, no, he would be. He's Fox. So
yeah. Ugh. And even Ryan Reynolds was like, the only way we're doing Deadpool is it has to be rated R. Disney Plus even has a section for the adult section where you can watch the rated R stuff like Deadpool, for instance.
Yeah.
I'm like, see, you can get away with it.
Well,
I
what's interesting is Disney used to do that. They just used to do it under a different moniker. They used to have, what was it, Touchstone was their adult brand in the 80s and 90s, and then they kind of abandoned that.
Yeah. I mean, parents take their kids to see Deadpool all the time. Like, I remember people, like, parents begging the movie, execs, but like, yo, I need to take my kids to see this film. He wants to see it. And then they come out like, how dare you make me see this, my child see this film? And they're like, you argued. We warned you.
Yeah, that's fair. It's gonna be interesting. Miss Marvel was an interesting choice. It's gonna be interesting to see where it goes. I think the other thing is right now they don't really have that many anchor heroes since Chad Boseman died. So there's that. What do you think of Love and Thunder? I have not heard good things about it. I haven't seen it yet.
It was fun. It was fun. Not as good as Ragnarok, but like I feel like, it was, very colorful and just fun overall. Chris Hemsworth's body is magnificent. The soundtrack was really good too. Taika Waititi, he's I feel like he's getting that Oscar ego because he keeps criticizing everything these days, and I'm like, dude, shush. He's like, he was criticizing Stranger Things for using Katie Hill, and I'm like, what, you mad you didn't come up with it first? He's running off the hill for something? You have Guns N' Roses.
Well, you know what's funny? That has led to Kate Bush having a renaissance 3 times in my life. So it's been wild where I'm like,
yeah, like I remember her song being used in an episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. That was my introduction to her music.
Yeah, I think that was a lot of people's introduction. I knew her from being an inspiration to people like Tori Amos when I was a kid. But I think I got I listened to Hounds of Love for the first time like 15 years ago. But it is interestingly timeless music, because one of the things I will say about Kate Bush is she doesn't actually feel that 80s. Like if you listen to her and listen to other 80s music, it doesn't feel the same. It's actually kind of unique.
More modern almost.
Yeah. You hear her influence on a lot of female kind of like avant-garde artists and indie artists, like from the late 90s forward, more than you probably heard it in the 80s itself.
Yeah.
And so that's an interesting choice. Guns N' Roses. Oh, Guns N' Roses. Talk about a personality that hasn't aged well, but Axl Rose got away with saying some shit in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's interesting. Taika Waititi is.
I love What We Do in the Shadows.
I do too. I actually like. I think I like. There's not a TV show he's done I don't like. So, including
the new season just dropped, and I'm excited for more episodes.
Yeah, it's that's actually a show that I think is better as a show than the movie, and I love the movie.
Yeah, so, I agree too.
And that's actually kind of rare. The other time I can think of that is Stargate. No, I'm kidding. That's an in joke for followers of Movie Night Extravaganza. Yep. Would you like to plug anything? We've been on for about 2 hours, so I'll let you go. But
yeah, because I'm gonna be streaming after this.
Do streamers sleep?
Yeah.
All right.
Some do. But yeah, follow me on twitch.tv/Kristina, and all my socials are at Kristina as well. So Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Woohoo.
All right. So you do the talk?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm too verbose for the talk. I can't. I've tried. It's like
I just lip sync to Bob's Burger stuff, and it gets good, decent views.
Fair enough. Talk is a fascinating thing for me because talk and Instagram put my brain to sleep. Like not in the sense that they bore me. I'm actually super fascinated. I just find that I'm not thinking at all when I'm watching. I'm like looking at talk or reels on Instagram. It's just a way to like. It's like white noise, and I don't know why, but it's kind of interesting to watch people like lip sync to things.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. This is the boomer moment. I think we should probably end on the boomer moment. All right. So you can follow Kristina. Kristina on Twitch, on all the socials. And you can see her over at Movie Night Extravaganza, which, and I will put all that in the show notes for people so they can find it. And thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it was fun. Have a good night.